Welcome to Forward Ever, Leading in Challenging Times, presented by Worth Wealth Management, a weekly conversation with area leaders about how to persevere during uncertain times. Now here's your host, Gary Shorman.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Forward Ever, Leading in Challenging Times. And tell you what, you never know when you might get to lead and be a part of an issue. And our guest today is Director of Tri-County Services Cooperative, that's based out of Fort Larned. And Denise Schmidt is our guest. Denise, good to have you on our program.
Good morning, Gary. Thank you for having me here. I appreciate it.
You know what? A couple of weeks ago, we talked about an issue that's taking place, frankly, involving the Wilson School, but also USD 112. And one of the things that's going on there's a vote coming up August 1st, that if passed, there's going to be an order issued that will disorganize that school district. Interesting process. It's the first that would have happened in Kansas. We talked about why voting yes is important. Denise, I think you want to bring some clarity to the issue. There's been a lot of discussion back to people in our office that I work with, and I know in the Wilson area, there's a whole lot of discussion. So first off, before we get into that, Denise, tell us about your background. How'd you get into education?
Well, I actually never was going to go into education. I am a 20-year veteran of special education. 20 years ago this year, I started as a paraprofessional, and I was immediately in that special ed classroom and thought there's no place I'd rather be. Started as a paraprofessional, moved up to being a special education teacher in both a rural district and in a large district. And my heart and my passion has always been for rural districts. I became an elementary building principal, and now I'm a special ed director, and I lead an organization that has over 100 employees, and we operate about a $1.5 million budget every year.
Now, you're based out of Fort Larned, but what other districts are you a part of, other than probably District 112 as well?
Well, I just want to clarify, although I'm the director of Tri-County Special Services, Tri-County Special Services in Fort Larned isn't a part of this discussion, but we do cover Pawnee Heights and Kinsley-Offerley. I come to you today, Gary, as a parent of a student in the USD 112 school district. I have an elementary student who's 10 years old. Also, I'm currently a doctoral student at Kansas State University, and the focus of my research and dissertation has been consolidation issues in rural Kansas 1A schools. And this is kind of the perfect intersection of all of that. So
boy, no kidding, because you're, not only involved in leadership side of things but putting together rural education and how that works, so important. I go back and when I started going to grade school, I went to a small rural country school, a one-room schoolhouse, so to speak, and we went through consolidation when I was a kid, just trying to figure out a way to transition from a bunch of little small schools into something that was maybe, I'll say, more practical, more efficient, and maybe a better educational facility as well. I think some of that is happening right now. So give us a brief history of the school district 112 since Claflin became involved. Is there a quick update for that?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So, and you were right, Gary, when you attended school, there used to be 9,000 Kansas schools and school districts, and now we're down to 287. And if you look at Kansas compared to most states, we are the rare exception that we allow little districts. Of the 287 districts in Kansas, 117 of them are small, 100, maybe 200 students. If you would go to a state like Florida, you're going to see only 52 districts that have thousands and thousands of students. So in Kansas, small school districts are a real rarity, and this is why this is important to everybody. And let me answer your question, and so your listeners can get a good understanding about USD 112. So USD 112, prior, and that formed in 2011. In 2010, most rural school districts in Kansas were really hurting, and not just the rural districts, the larger ones too. There had been state funding changes at the state level, and so there was a bill that was introduced that allowed school districts, if they consolidated in a hopes to get more consolidations, that they were allowed to keep their level of funding in very uncertain times for 5 years. And so what many school districts did at that time was they joined together, and Claflin was no exception. So prior to 2010, Claflin, although a small district, had no debt. It didn't have a lot of students. And as it continued to look at that preschool class that first year, they had 4 students, and they were thinking to the future. What can we do so that 20 years down the road, we still have a functional educational opportunity for our students? Quivira Heights was in the Lorain School District, and on the southern end in Holyrood and Bushton, Quivira Heights was one district. But they also had Wilson on the north end. And so Quivira Heights was only about 10 miles down the road from Claflin. And so those 2 boards entered into discussion, and that was really driven by patrons. Patrons said, wait a minute, these are uncertain funding times. Let's join together to provide the best educational opportunities and long-term sustainability for our students. And that's what they did. And so those buildings closed. Claflin Elementary, that had lost 50% of its population, closed. And a new district was formed, and that was USD 112 Central Plains. Now, the attendance centers in that district were Wilson, which got to keep its K through 12 building untouched. They did not have to change their mascot. They did not have to change anything about them because that's what their patrons wanted, and the board allowed them to do that. On the southern end, we had communities of Claflin, Odin, Bushton, Holyrood, Lorain. They all came together, and that was driven by their students. Their students in the 2 different high schools said, let's come up with a new mascot. Let's come up with new colors. We want unity. Let's join together. So a new attendance center for elementary was made at Central Plains Elementary, which is in Holyrood, Central Plains Middle School, which was in Bushton, and Central Plains High School, which was in Claflin. And those students, that very first class of students that started, have now all graduated. So the only thing our students have ever known is one united community. And the people that you had before respectfully just called us Claflin. And to call us just Claflin is very disrespectful. That would be like saying, Gary, that every listener in Western Kansas is from Hayes. That's not true. There's thousands or hundreds of communities in Western Kansas, and they're diverse. So we are a diverse group of communities, but we come together. We don't see ourselves as Claflin or Bushton or Holyrood. We see ourselves as Oilers.
So what's you talk about things that are concerning, but what's the misinformation about the disorganization petition? Because what that frankly does is just dissolve USD 112. But what's the misinformation about that?
So a couple of things about misinformation is that this is only driven due to finances. That is not entirely true. This is a hard decision, and we all recognize closing one attendance center is hard. But that isn't necessarily done because the district is in poor financial shape. Actually, the district has quite a bit of assessed value. We're similar in tax revenue to a district 3 times our size. This is a matter that Wilson Junior Senior High School has lost 50% of its student population in 10 years, and it's continuing to decline. So that's a great misconception. The other misconception is that this just affects Wilson. It doesn't. It affects every single student, and there are almost 500 students in the Central Plains School District. If you vote no or a patron votes no, every community gets to keep an attendance center. They get to keep a school. Wilson Elementary, Claflin gets to keep Central Plains High, and Holyrood gets to keep Central Plains Elementary School. If this does go through in a yes vote, the organizational power of USD 112 ceases. All of those attendance centers close July 1st, 2024. And the other great misconception is that a school district can come in and just reopen. We could all reform and reorganize. We cannot do that. There's no Kansas statute that gives any entity organizational power to form a new public school district. So this would essentially close 3 buildings and displace 500 students and families.
Well, talk a little bit. Does the state board come in and get involved in any of this? Or, I
Absolutely.
mean, it appears to me like the process has been a little bit, I'll say disorganized, but the process has been new to everybody. And so it's kind of gone along. And here we are with the vote coming up on August 1st. But where does the state board fit in with this?
So if a yes vote were to go through, and I do want to clarify to your readers, only 20% of those that signed a petition brought this vote about. It only requires 20% of signatures. So to say that the vast majority of patrons are unhappy is a misnomer. Where the state board would come in is if a yes vote were to go through and Central Plains USD 112 would be disorganized on July 1st, 2024, the State Board of Education would appoint a hearing officer. And this will most likely be an attorney from Topeka who probably has never even been to our community, who will then take public comment on where students should be placed. And the state board right now allows 3 minutes per speaker. As a parent, in 3 minutes, could I explain why my student needs to attend this school and why this is best for my community? No. And I think that's a really scary thing. As you know, in leadership, there are always going to be decisions that are unpopular. But if we allow local control to go away for the state board or somebody in Topeka to make that decision, that's a slippery slope for all of us, not only in education, but in local government and representative government. And I just think that's a very difficult place to be in Western and Central Kansas in these rural communities.
One of the side things I know you're working on as a parent, one thing is how that affects your students, your children. That's important. But from a bigger standpoint, with your work you're doing with K-State, what does this all mean to Western Kansas or maybe smaller communities across the state? What would a disorganization of one district mean for the rest of the state?
And let's also point out that we're not the only district facing this. USD 113, which is Prairie Hills, which is in the northern part of the state, another district that came together during those hard economic times of 2010, is also possibly facing this as well. But that's an excellent question, Gary. When you look at Western Kansas and Central Kansas, if you actually look at a lot of those small communities, the vast majority of stable middle-class jobs come from those that work for the local school district. There are 107 employees for USD 112. That's a $3.3 million annual payroll. Those people have houses in these communities. They own their homes. They send their kids to school here. Their spouses are usually employed in the local community. If these people were to lose their jobs, most of them have stated they're not going to stay. And why should they? Teachers are needed all over the state. Many of them are going to pick up and move to Salina, Hayes, Wichita. And so our local economies will essentially shutter. And that is something that people really need to realize. The other thing is what it'll do to our tax base. USD 112 is surrounded by 10 other school districts. So our students will be chopped up into little bitty pieces and sent each way. A majority, all but one, of those other districts have much higher tax rates and mill levies. So now people are going to have to pay higher taxes. And again, a lot of them won't stay, or it's going to be economically devastating to our families in agriculture and then also our small business owners. So this has a pretty substantial ripple effect for our local economies. Like I said, education and those in education are essential middle-class jobs for our communities.
Would there have been a way to avoid all of this? I know there was some timing issues with some of it, but it seems like we got it, I'll say Western Kansas, the we kind of thing versus just in Wilson, because I don't live in Wilson. I don't live in Holyrood or Claflin. But would there have been a way to avoid all of this?
I think that's a complicated question. For those that work in education, there's a lot of really dedicated, smart people. And if there were easy answers, they would have found them. I used to work for the Central Plains School District, and it's been several years. And years ago, we were having the discussion, how can we come together? How can we do things more efficiently? We might be apart geographically, but how can we come together? We talked about things like a 4-day school week or sharing teachers. And there's just not necessarily practical solutions. the Kansas Association of School Boards actually came together and did a configuration study and gave different scenarios. And every scenario that was approached had pros to it, but it also had cons. Like I said, there are no easy answers. So although we sympathize with our patrons in Wilson and we know it's hard to shut that building, you're still going to get to keep in a no vote the elementary school, and every place gets to keep an attendance center. And it does give us an opportunity to have those conversations about maybe what could we have did better as a district? How in the future can we move forward? But there's no do-over in this. If a yes vote goes through and we're disorganized, it stops. There's no appeal process. There's no appealing to your state legislature. We're done. So, I wish I had better answers. I do. And I would probably, as they say, there's $1 million questions. And if I had the answer to how we could fix this, that probably would be worth $1 million. I would also say patrons really need to pay attention to the Kansas legislature. 51% of the state budget goes to education. So the legislature, particularly in rural communities, is passing laws that might be harmful or helpful to your community. Pay attention to that. Pay attention to the Kansas State School Board elections. Who really decides what's going on in your schools isn't necessarily your local school board, but your Kansas State School Board. So maybe those are things that patrons can do that will help their communities in issues like this.
Well, Denise, want to take a break here and come back. And I know when you talk about misinformation, the only way to learn more is not necessarily just thinking what you think and talking to your neighbor. It's really going and finding out what's going on by attending meetings where people are involved in discussing this. I know you have some meetings coming up that I hope people can attend. Get your pencil and paper ready there if you're out listening to this, because there are some dates that are important. Denise, I think you have those. We'll get those. And then I also want to sum things up on why you should vote no or why you should vote yes and what you're going to get for each one. Our guest today is Denise Schmidt, who's a part of the whole process of dealing with the change in this organization vote that's coming up for USD 112. Back with more after this.
The most successful investors are those that can keep their emotions in check and take a longer-term view at what portfolios will be worth 3 to 5 years down the road. I'd say that's the most important in determining what investor outcomes are. Market corrections will continue in the future. We've seen many of them over the years, only to see equity prices rise higher, and that'll be the case in the future.
Worth Wealth Management, enhancing lives and strengthening families.
Welcome back to Forward Ever with our guest, Denise Schmidt, who is the director of Tri-County Services Cooperative, but has a student that attends in District 112 and is a part of the process of voting yes or voting no on August 1st. There's some meetings coming up, Denise. We were talking about those and how important it is. What's going to be discussed at these meetings? And then I know you have the dates and times for those.
Sure. So the Kansas State Department of Education actually has their deputy director coming out to talk to all patrons of the district, along with their general legal counsel. And that is coming right up. It's actually next week. It is June the 27th. And at 6:30 p.m., that will be at the Claflin Catholic Parish Center. And at 8 o'clock, that will be at the Wilson Catholic Parish Center. So June 27th, 6:30 in Claflin and 8 in Wilson. And those meetings are open to the public, and all patrons and interested citizens are invited to come to those. We also have a Facebook page if you'd just like to get more information on this, and that is United USD 112. We also have a website where you can come and look at Kansas Department of Education documents, and that's UnitedUSD112.com.
As we end up, Denise, explain just briefly why you would vote yes, and then why you would vote no, and what that means, and then talk about your feeling as a parent. So why would somebody vote yes, and what will happen there? Just in a good overview of what takes place. I know it's complicated.
Sure.
But just give a quick, why would you vote yes, and what would that do?
So a patron that would vote yes would say that they agree that USD 112 should be disorganized. that disorganization or ceasing of activity would occur on July 1st, 2024. That would then allow the state to place students in the 10 surrounding school districts that border USD 112.
Okay, voting no then would mean what?
Voting no would keep a school building in every single attendance center that is in USD 112. So Wilson Elementary, if you vote no, will stay open, and will stay open as many years as possible. Central Plains Elementary in Holyrood will stay open as many years as possible. And Central Plains High School, located in Claflin, will stay open as many years as possible. A vote no would also ensure that our tax rates stay the same and our staff stays the same. Essentially, a vote no will keep everything as it has been for our district and for 500 students to receive their education in their local communities with local board control.
When we talked about this earlier and talked about how that would work, we had a parent involved. You're obviously a parent involved. Talk about it from the parent's perspective of what you're looking for, just personally. This had to do with all the rest of it, but just what do you want as a parent?
Well, as a parent, we just want our students in rural schools to have the same opportunity everybody else has. And I, as an educator and as a parent, I often don't worry about my student because I know they're probably going to be resilient and okay. But I worry about the other kids. And I worry about those kids that might not have had the opportunities or have more struggles. I have a friend and she lives in northern Burton County. And right now, her students love coming to Central Plains, and they always have. Her students are young children, second graders and a fourth grader. They're on a bus for almost an hour and 10 minutes. If she's assigned in a yes vote to another district, those young students are going to spend an hour and 30 minutes driving on a bus to a new attendance center. Is that good for young children? Absolutely not. I worry about our special education students who've always been serviced in the school and with the teachers they know. If those schools closed, now they're going to be assigned to new buildings and school districts that they don't have any connection to. And special education services are not the same in every building. They're different. I worry about those kids that just struggle academically. Central Plains Elementary School in 2019 was awarded the highest honor for academics that can be given by Washington, D.C., and they were a blue ribbon school. And when we move students to a place they don't know, that's going to struggle, particularly for our elementary kids. Those are your formidable critical years where your education matters the most. And if we're displacing those students to where parents don't have choice, I worry about that education. And I just worry about the future of our communities. One of the wonderful things we see in Central Plains on the southern end is we have almost 50% of our best and our brightest. They're going off to college, they're getting married, they're bringing their families back, they're young professionals, college graduates, VOTEC graduates, business owners. And I want that for my student. If he wants to come back in 20 years and give me some grandkids, hopefully, and have a wife and live here and send their kids to a small rural school in our community, that would be wonderful. If he wants to go live in the big city, I'll be upset, but I'll understand that too. But that's what I want as a parent for my student. I want stability.
Well, the vote's coming up, couple big dates. August 1st is when the vote comes, and vote yes, vote no. You've talked about that.
Yes.
And more importantly, there's informational meetings that one is coming up on June 27th. And
Yes.
give us that information. One is going to be in Claflin. That one's earlier. The next one's going to be in Wilson. I would encourage anybody that cares about what's going on to not just talk about it, but go attend the meeting and participate. So when are the dates? The date's the 27th, but what are the
Yes.
times for those meetings?
So again, at 6:30 p.m. at the Claflin Parish Center, Catholic Parish Center. And at 8 o'clock, they'll have the same presenters from KSDE, and that's at the Wilson Catholic Parish Center.
Denise, thank you for joining us on our program today. I know it's a complicated issue,
It is a
so I hope
complicated
people
issue.
get out and understand what's going on and how this takes place, because in our rural parts of the state, this makes a big difference. Denise, thanks for what you do, including working with those special needs, special ed students. So that's a big job.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Gary, for having me on today.
And thanks to you for listening and watching Forward Ever, Leading in Challenging Times. It's brought to you by Worth Wealth Management, where you can live with confidence. I'm Gary Shorman.
Thanks for joining us for Forward Ever, Leading in Challenging Times, presented by Worth Wealth Management. Join us right here next week for another episode with host Gary Shorman. Until then, remember to move forward ever, backward never.